we turn our attention to what might be called the libertarian left, or more popularly, anarchism.
This is the same logic shared by Marx and Freud.
Functioning libertarian socialist institutions, I think they are an interesting model that I think is highly relevant.
What has happened? So much has happened.
Oh, we moved. Well, I moved out.
Yeah, we both moved, technically. I just moved within the same house.
And I have moved out the house. Very, very sad.
Yeah, no, it's weird, because how am I going to explain that to the officer that's assigned to us when we get married?
Yeah. But yeah, I moved out. I'm now in a different house, which is where we're currently recording. Hopefully it sounds...
Okay.
Yeah. It's a bigger room, so maybe it'll be a bit echoey.
But this time we do have a microphone, each of us.
Yeah, we upgraded. Well, we already had 2 microphones just the whole of the last season. We didn't buy the £5 cable needed to operate the last microphone.
And it was pure laziness because it was £5.
Yeah.
But no, we haven't.
So hopefully what this means is I won't need to do as much audio editing. You know what I mean? Like, I've had to turn people up and turn people down, and usually it involves me turning me up, but now I can be very close to the microphone.
Yeah, I almost feel like I need to get like intimately more close to mine. I'm gonna move that. So this is the second and final part, finally, of Epistemology of the Closet.
We know you've been waiting for us to finish the book.
By the time we take out this episode, the person that was waiting for that second part has graduated.
But we thought we would come back and read it and give our thoughts, opinions, feelings.
We will talk about it more at the end, but I didn't mind the book. I just feel like reading it in its entirety as someone that doesn't have a literature background was quite difficult. So if you are a literature person and you're doing queer studies in literature, the book for you. But as someone that doesn't really do that, it was quite difficult to read through. It's challenging.
So if you don't know what we're talking about, I recommend you go look at Epistemology of the Closet Part 1 from the first season. This is a book by just a brief summary. We give a much larger summary of the author and the book in the first episode, so highly recommend. But this is a book by Eve Kosofsky Sedwick that was written in 1990. And the basic premise behind the book is kind of 2 things. One, that there is a artificial binary between homosexuality and heterosexuality, and this binary opposition is too simplistic and also limits kind of our ability to understand and kind of knowledge production. And the second point that she kind of makes is kind of around language, and the language of homosexuality being a term that's loaded with kind of negative stereotypes and stuff like this, and why that might be. This book's really well known for the introduction and kind of the first chapter, which is all about the closet and how the closet functions. Again, listen to the first episode if you want to hear more about that.
Yeah, and in the first episode, we also provide a lot of historical context as to what's happening in the United States at the time. Also, Sedgwick's own field of work within that time period. If you feel like you're going to be confused this episode as to why we're not giving a lot more historical context, if any at all, it's mostly due because we already discussed it in part 1, and as you will very soon find out, these last 3 chapters are mostly literature with very little context as to what time period she's exactly discussing.
And so I'm going to give a brief summary of the 3 chapters that we're looking at. For this episode, we read chapter 3, 4, and 5, which are the final 3 chapters of this book.
No conclusion.
No conclusion. Interesting. So Chapter 3 is a continuation of Chapter 2, which you will know our thoughts. If you listened to our last episode, we weren't too impressed.
We're not fans.
So this chapter, it's called Some Binarisms 2, Wild Nature and the Sentimental Relations of the Male Body. So this chapter is all about Wild and Nietzsche and how they reinforce homophobic anxieties and the distance of heterosexuality from desire, and also how kind of emotions play out in masculinity and understandings of masculinity at the time. And so Chapter 4 is called The Beast in the Closet, James and the Writing of Homosexual Panic. And this is all about kind of Victorian and Gothic literature and how they understood sexual orientation and her readings of homosexuality into these kind of texts that she talks about. And then she talks about, again, this distancing of desire or the lack of desire in masculinity as they kind of understood it. And I think it's also, if I didn't say already, Victorian and Gothic in literature, mostly in England, I believe. And so Chapter 5 then is called Proust and the Spectrality of the Closet, and this is a discussion of the novel The Search of Lost Time by Marcel Proust, and this is a discussion of two queer characters from the novel that are presented as feminine, opposed from the rest of the world of the text. And that also serves as sort of the conclusion, sort of. We'll talk about it. But one thing I will say is if you have not read the text that Sedgwick is talking about, neither have we. So we're going to be talking about mostly the main kind of themes that we get as people from different disciplines. So some of the texts we're aware of and have knowledge of, but we're not we haven't read them ourselves.
The only one I can say confidently was Picture of Dorian Gray, and I haven't read that since I was in my first year of my bachelor's. I own a beautiful copy of it. I haven't reread it recently.
But hopefully this will still be an interesting episode and you can kind of get what we got from the text. Yeah. So we're trying to make our episodes a little bit quicker, a little bit snappier than the previous season. So we're going to jump straight into Chapter 3. And the main point of discussion that we want to talk about is this notion of sentimentality versus anti-sentimentality and the relationship towards sexuality that Sedgwick kind of brings out.
So Sedgwick really introduces this chapter with Christianity versus the polytheistic ancient Roman / ancient Greek relationship with the male body. So she also coats this chapter with imagery of not only that, but also introducing Nazi imagery. So my own field of study. So this chapter is quite relevant to what I do, but I don't know if it was done in a way that is easily legible. So this is one of the longer of the chapters as well. I think it was about 50-something pages. And in it, she discusses everything from a, Spartan ideal without actually saying Spartan ideal, all the way to country music and how singing about God is like the closest thing Christianity allows to singing about love for men. And it's all like boiling to the point of what does sentimentality look like and how is it expressed in these two different forms of religion. And what I found truly fascinating, because the stuff with ancient Greek and Roman, I've heard it before. It's very much discussed, especially if you are in German culture history and you know about Adolf Brand and, the contemporary worship of Greek and Roman idealism. A tale as old as time and a historical thing, which we can discuss at some other point in some other episode. But what I found truly fascinating was the use of hymns and how in hymns, when you sing to capital H God, like he, it is a way for men to express this like love for each other or love for a male figure. I just find it fascinating, and I wish she could have focused a little bit more on that. And then if you want to go into the anti-sentimentality of that as well, Hannah.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out here what is also interesting. I don't know it fully, so apologies if there's some gaps in my knowledge, but Sedgwick is talking about the history that is more familiar to me, which is like kind of 19th century, late 18th century England. And so when she's talking about the classical period, as well as this kind of Victorian sentimentality or anti-sentimentality, as she calls it, she's also drawing lines. So the Victorians, in all their popular culture, was really obsessed with the classical period. They absolutely like brought that into everything they do, including there was this obsession with masculine ideals from this time period, which then later become questioned. And so she's also drawing a connection with that. It's not very clear that she's doing that. I feel like the next chapter is much clearer in her intention, and I wonder if that's because she's written a book about it before, so it was more clear.
Yeah, I believe she talks more about this in Between Men.
And so I'm not gonna lie, like I was a tiny bit confused with stuff to do with this chapter. So what I think she's trying to do, and maybe Paula can correct me because I don't know my Christian references, let's be honest, but what I think she's trying to do in this chapter is blur the line between homosexuality and heterosexuality, breaking down this binary by pointing out some of the homoeroticism in classical and Christian references to articulate that this line is really arbitrary.
Yeah, and for that, I'm going to use the two quotes. So one of them is on page 136, which is, "The Victorian cult of Greece gently, unappointedly, and exclusively positioned male flesh and muscle as the indicative instances of, quote, the body, end quote, of a body whose surfaces, features, and abilities might be the subject and object of euphobic enjoyment." And then on page 138, it is quite a long quote, so I'm just going to go through very quickly. It's, "The crystallization of desire as temptation of the young body as the always unitary encroachment of a rose red on rose white gives the game of wholeness away in advance. Each of these enunciations show the Hellenistic ideal, insofar as the reintegrative power is supposed to involve the healing of culture-wide ruptures involved in male homosexual panic." And I'm going to end that quote there because it goes into more complicated notions that I don't think we have time for. But what I find really fascinating about this comparison, she calls it Victorian, but I want to throw it all the way back to even Renaissance idealism, where sexuality, both heterosexual and homosexual, was better explored through pieces that were of mythology, because it was easier to hide these desires within mythological context, whereas through the Christian aspect, it had to remain pure and tame and of suffering. But in the same way, and this is where I think it goes into the being brought up Catholic, there's also the concept in Catholicism of transubstantiation, where you transform the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. So there is like an ingestion of fluid and of meat and flesh. And yes, you can interpret it as cannibalistic, but you can also see it as partaking in the body, enjoying a body that is possibly the same gender as yours. And that is where she's insinuating that there is that weird blurred line. It's just like homosexuality is a consumption of flesh. Why is it so wrong when you do it through metaphor or ritual?
Yeah. So when we're talking about sentimentality and anti-sentimentality, and shall we define it? Sentimentality is an exaggerated and self-indulgent tenderness, sadness, or nostalgia. And so anti-sentimentality is the choice not to give importance to emotional feelings and dealing with fact, basically. Very objective versus subjective, I guess, similar. And so she starts to talk a little bit, and it jumps around a lot. Apologies if we're jumping around a lot, like we're trying to make sense of something that is difficult.
And she also involves Nietzsche in this, so it's already a difficult subject of religion plus Nietzsche.
Yeah, it's a lot. And so she starts talking about, in feminism, there was a discussion of the sentimental in 19th century American women's fiction, and the idea that the sentimental is seen as derogatory code for female bodies and the female domestic and kind of reproduction and birth and socialization. Women are seen as more emotional, basically. And so she says that there's been an influential project in popular feminist thought that is to take this idea of the sentimental and reverse this negative charge attached to it. And she says, actually, there's a similar, she calls it rehabilitation, which I like. There's a similar rehabilitation of the sentimental as a gay male project as well. So this idea of gay men having feminine characteristics, it's like a stereotype. It's a stereotype of gay men to be like more like women.
Yeah, and the reason that she's bringing this up is because she's talking about the beginnings of like the creation of the word homosexuality. Always comes back to Germany, baby. It's going back into that Karl Heinrich Ulrich's thing of a gay man has like a female soul, and it goes into, you know, very early 20th century, late 19th century ideas of what like is homosexuality. And it's stuff that hasn't left us even now. Like, she's refuting all these ideas of sentimentality just because you're not a man or you're not the hegemonic construction of a man. You must have feminine characteristics, where it's negating or not giving into the fact that the man can just be sensitive.
By the way, that theory is called sexual inversion, if you ever want to look it up.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, it's really interesting. But essentially, that kind of sexual inversion theory, as well as other things, led to the medicalization of homosexuality for lots of different reasons.
No, and actually we have discussed this in previous episodes last season. Off the top of my head, I'm thinking camp. Our episode on camp, and then our other epistemological episode. So if you want to know more about that, there you go. And if you want further information, also check out our Intro to Queer History.
So one of the things she says is that Foucault treats homosexuality and sexual inversion as interchangeable when he speaks about it. And Foucault's very, if you've listened to some of our previous episodes, Foucault is like one of the main people who started us thinking about homosexuality, and he writes the history of sexuality, and she's basically saying that he treats homosexuality and sexual inversion as interchangeable when actually they're not, and that homosexuality then becomes a term based on the sameness of gender. But Sedgwick says, actually on 159, I certainly do not believe that any given man must be assumed to have more in common with any other given man than he can possibly have in common with any given woman. End quote.
Sorry, we were interrupted by someone fixing their Model T car. Jesus.
We can only apologize because there is car fixing happening outside this new flat.
This man is silencing us.
What else is new?
So back to the actual, it's a short quote, I swear. It is page 161, quote, "Not everyone has a lover of their own, but everyone, after all, has a self of their own sex." End quote. That's a bar. And it also, I think, is a really good summary of her relationship with, like, Foucault as well, where she's sort of going away from the concept of gender and even, dare I say, identity a little tiny bit here. Obviously, identity is still a big part of her argument. She focuses on gay cis men that love other cis men, but she's sort of starting to break down identity and sort of blur the lines, because also the entire time throughout this book until the very, very end of this book, which I think should be briefly mentioned in our conclusion, is her lack of talking about bisexual men. And a lot of these arguments don't really fall under bisexual men. So that's why we're saying cis homosexual men, because these arguments really don't work. But it's a really complicated chapter. Multiple points. And if you're very well versed in Nietzschean philosophy and Oscar Wilde and Christianity and ancient Rome and Greek mythology and history, this is the chapter for you.
If you're interested in all those things.
And if you're interested in German history. It's a complicated chapter.
Oh, I think that can give you a sense, we did it in the last episode, but it can give you a sense of what kind of world Sedgwick is working in. So she talks about Wilde, as in Oscar Wilde.
Who else would she be talking about?
I don't know. I need to give the full name.
There's not that many Wildes and gay.
Okay, so our reaction to this has just shown you. But she basically says on page 165 to 166, reading Dorian Gray from our 20th century vantage point, where the name Oscar Wilde virtually means homosexual. A little bit before this, on 160 to 161, she talks about teaching the picture of Dorian Gray in class, and she was teaching a class at Amherst College, and half the students said that they had studied Dorian Gray in previous classes, but nobody had discussed it in terms of homosexual content. And now that just seems impossible. How can you talk about this book without talking about its relationship to homosexuality? But this is the world she was existing in. So sometimes I felt like her writing feels like how queer historians are they often have to defend the work they do and be I have fully evidenced this, I know this person is queer, I know this and this. She's trying to do that in a literary sense, right? She's going, my reading is correct, here is every source you could need.
And where I find it, and this is me personally, what I find very problematic about this is that it becomes antithetical, where she's trying to step away and blur these binaries and lines. She comes back and then relies again on that binary.
Yeah, so that's what we drew from that chapter. And now I want to talk about this fourth chapter, which is all about kind of homosexuality in Renaissance England in the literature, and we're going to talk about bachelordom. But first I want to say this chapter is quite solid in how it introduces the historical context.
It was very good.
She's written a book on this before, so this is her bread and butter, she knows it. But she talks about Alan Bray's homosexuality in Renaissance England, which Alan Bray's work is really good, especially his work on friendship.
Yeah, you're way more familiar. You had to actually explain it a little bit to me, because I need to read it, actually, but I'm glad that you did.
Yeah, so when she's talking about Alan Bray and homosexuality in Renaissance England, picture very religious, picture there's a self-created police force called the Society for the Reformation of Manners. This is in 1690. And so they come together and essentially just police the streets, and they start ousting homosexual people. You also get an undercurrent of homosexual culture that's starting to happen called molly houses. And molly houses were essentially the equivalent now of coffee houses or pubs. And there were women running these molly houses, and it would be essentially refuges for gay men to go have sex with each other, have a nice time, essentially like an early gay club.
Like a 1690s YMCA.
Yeah, it was sick.
You could hang out with all the boys.
And so you get, also during this time, just because I love it, so let's throw a bit in here, you get men calling each other female names, so this was quite often. You get cruising happening, so this is where you go in certain streets and certain places that you know other gay men are going to be to try and hook up with people. This is also how they were getting caught. Because
soliciting?
Yeah, because the police would protect the police. They weren't the police. They were just people that were trying to catch gay people. So they would pretend to be gay and make their way in. And then you had essentially what's sort of like drag and cross-dressing. So you had these people acting out feminine roles through cross-dressing and mock rituals such as birth. So they would pretend to give birth, or they would act out giving birth, which we still don't know what that was. We just know it happened. And then you also get something called marriage, so early gay marriage, where you essentially are having sex with your same-sex partner in a ceremony where people would watch, and there would also be people outside, but you're also getting more traditional forms of gay marriage that is happening. Obviously not legal at this time, but the vibes are there, you know?
But what we were discussing off mic was also that in certain countries, like I'm currently doing some research for a class that I'm teaching this year, and it was in early 20th century Poland that there is these like friendship bonds that skirted legality. Some of them were legit, some of them were not legit, but it was like a form of like fealty to each other, where they could exchange like even money and land for each other. And it can read as a marriage, but it's coded in friendship. And I think this is a good transition into the meat of this chapter, which is, what is friendship? Like, when a lot of people see same-sex people living together, they're like, oh, what nice friends, you know? Like, there's that stereotype. They were friends, roommates, anything but lovers. But there is this time period where friendship was a good way to hide your homosexuality. And there was also just really close friendships that could resemble homosexuality and actually weren't. And, you know, this is probably because this is my subject of studies. I find that very fascinating. And I think Sedgwick did a really good job in sort of never defining it. In not defining it, she continues the work she's done in previous chapters of doing away with that binaryism.
And she's also starting to point out how men are starting to create this binary, right? So she's not actually saying it is either or, but she's saying actually this binary is being created because essentially during this time you get men spending all their time with each other and not really spending any time with women, but then they also couldn't, there was clearly a line that they could not cross in terms of when is our care and love for each other not acceptable? Like, when is it moving into the homosexual versus the homosocial?
And also, please note, this is never mentioned by Sedgwick, but this is all class as well. The examples that she's using are people of very upper middle class to even bordering monarchy. So these are people that have leisure, and leisure is a huge aspect of this. Not saying that homosexual people did not exist in lower classes.
Yeah, we just have less evidence of them.
Well, it's also a different relationship, because if you're working all the time, you're going to be around men all the time, because you usually would work within same-sex environments. But where she's talking about these friendships and like where these lines are blurred are mostly in places of leisure, in places where you don't have to spend the time here and yet you do. And where I think it goes into a bit awry was her inclusion of the military, because in these parts of her argument, she did start off with 18th century military, but I don't know where she ends, because she goes on to describe how it's evolved, but I'm like, okay, but when? Because if she's going into her contemporary, that would be the mid to late 90s, where women in the military are starting to show up a lot more, especially under the Clinton administration. So if she's including that type of contemporary, the argument kind of also a little bit fails, not fully, but a little tiny bit. Or she's still sticking to the 18th century ideals. It's a little bit mishmashy.
Yeah. So the way she starts this conversation is that she says essentially men in this homosocial spectrum essentially are defining themselves not as homosexual against the homosexual, which is interesting. And then she says that there's this double bind where there is an acute manipulability through the fear of one's own homosexuality, and second, a reservoir of potential violence caused by the self-ignorance that this regime is enforcing. And then that's where she starts to talk about the armed forces and saying, actually, this manipulability and violence is at an all-time high when men are together in the military. Essentially saying that these men have to bond because they're all together, but then this anti-homosexual is like super high as well.
And the one thing that she's not acknowledging is that these bonds are presented for survival. So you're forced to bond so that you care for your fellow person, so that when you go off to battle, you will do anything for each other to survive. And it's something that she's not really taking into consideration. Yeah. She's more looking about how space functions, and she's looking at bonds once more in a very romantic sense and completely ignoring what those bonds are meant to do, how they're meant to function. And this is where, once more, I think it's very interesting in what I see what she's trying to do, but she's not really looking at the personhood of it. She's looking at it once more in a very rose-tinted aspect.
But I wonder if that's just because she's looking at literature, right? Which is a rose-tinted aspect. Like, she says that she wants to look at Gothic literature because it involves more discussions of private and public discourses. And so you get this, like, male homosexual desire really palpable throughout this kind of work.
Yeah, of course, that does feed into bachelordom and, like, the concept of bachelordom. Something I don't think really doesn't translate that easily to our contemporary time. Even in, like, I think the early 2000s, there was still, like, bachelordom. But I'm not sure if it's used nowadays.
Essentially, a bachelor was a man who is not married, essentially. And so during this time period, men would get married between 20 and 30. But also, you're having to think about these men being like the provider in a way they're not really now, right? So they are having to provide money and all this kind of stuff. So this is also based on class. And same for women. So women were married at an average of about 24 years old, but the preferred age was between 17 or 21. That got younger as you were higher up in class because you would be married off to secure certain things. So stuff like that is happening. But she's essentially saying that bachelors were questioned if they were not getting married for, like, longer into their life, essentially.
It was also, like, a delicate word to use for a possibly questionable act. So a man that was identified as homosexual, even if they didn't say out loud, and didn't want to marry and wanted to have their independence or their private wealth and wanted to continue practicing this childlike leisure, were called lifelong bachelors. But that could be code for 3 different things. It could be code for someone that just wanted to work. They just focused on their job. They're just a focused bachelor. Someone that liked to party, like Oscar Wilde, but that, Oscar Wilde dipped his toes in many different pools. Or it was just someone that wanted to party and didn't want to care for a family and just didn't want those attachments. Or they were homosexual and then they just didn't want that life. And you could be all the above.
Yeah. And it's, she ends the chapter by saying this really interesting quote, which is, "It is not a closet in which there is a homosexual man. Instead, it is a closet of simply the homosexual secret, the closet of imagining a homosexual secret." So there's this notion that even if you are not in the closet per se, you are in a closet or you have a closet because there's this homosexual imagining that, like, oh, maybe you are homosexual because you're not choosing marriage, you're not doing X, Y, and Z, you're not fulfilling your masculine role in the correct way.
Yeah, and she sort of also ends with, like, the concept of compulsory heterosexuality, where in that the lifestyle that they wish to have, it goes against the hegemonic constructions of male identity and male presentation. So they convince themselves that this is what they want, and then it is not what they want, and everyone suffers, which is basically the next chapter.
This next chapter, I've got to be honest, like, I knew a lot less about it. So
Me as well.
I kind of gained more points about the closet. And there is some really interesting stuff in here about the closet and the idea of a glass closet and all this kind of stuff.
This was a difficult one because neither of us have read Proust. And I know some of you are going to be yelling at the clouds and throwing your fists in the air. How dare you talk about this chapter and not know Proust? Well, buy us the book.
Also, buy me time. Yeah, I think maybe we'll do Proust in the future, but for now, like, we don't know.
Yeah, so we're a bit lost in terms of the literary references. However, what we found quite interesting about this chapter was that one of the characters is seen as someone whose closet is made out of glass / transparent. So when he tells the female character of his own identity and she tells other people, you know, the entire time everything's just spent in panic of like, oh my God, who knows? What would they do once they know, once they find out? And I think it's interesting just because what do you mean the closet's made out of glass?
Yeah, she also introduces like two different other forms of the closet. So she says there's a access between two closets, and this is on page 222 to 223. In the first place, the closet viewed the spectacle of the closet, and in the second, its hidden framer and consumer, the closet inhabited the viewpoint of the closet. So when we're talking about the glass closet, it's not just the person who is inside that closet, it's also who is viewing that closet. And, you know, the glass closet is a common colloquial term now, essentially meaning that person's gay and I can tell. Like, the closet was made of glass when somebody comes out.
Paper thin.
Yeah.
The closet door was actually open.
It's interesting to think about, like, how she's thinking of the closet at this time. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think, you know, this is in the 90s, and it is quite dangerous to say that you can tell someone's in the closet. You can suspect, I guess, closetness, but that is taking away the person's process of their own identity. If they even want to process it at all, it's inferring and it is attaching an identity to someone against their will.
Yeah. And again, it goes into that like binarization of homosexual, heterosexual, which she's trying to break down. And I think she is doing it. So she says on page 231, the efficacy of M.D. Charles for the novel as a whole depends so much on Proust presenting the spectacle of the closet as the truth of the homosexual. Essentially saying that this connection is drawn, and I read that as like, that's not actually the case, right?
Yeah, because it's also, once more, it goes back to that concept of sentimentality, anti-sentimentality. What if that person has just an effeminate speech or likes stereotypical feminine things and just doesn't identify as anything? It's not considering asexuality in a way where this could step into, or it can take off many boxes of what would be considered a closet made out of glass, but it's not really a closet. It doesn't exist. It's just a person living their best life.
Yeah. And she also says this other quote on page 246, which is, "We must know by now, in the racking jointure of minoritizing and universalizing tropes of male sexual definition, better than to assume that there is a homosexual man waiting to be uncovered in each of the closets, constituting and constituted by the modern regime of the closer, yet it is by the homosexual question, which has never so far been empty of its homophobic impulsions, that the energy of their construction and exploitation continues to be marked." Essentially, what we're saying.
Yeah, so I'm just like, what's the truth, Sedgwick?
Yeah, so I think she's basically trying to say, like, the idea of the closet is damaging and painful. Again, what I was saying, like, at the beginning, this idea that this binary is both damaging and is also preventing knowledge production, because we're always binarizing our thought rather than thinking outside of this binary, and also saying that, talking about the negative stereotypes, right?
And it's also, that's completely cultural and of the time period. What constitutes as homosexual changes. Like, these stereotypes change with time. Usually it is rooted in, like, what we considered feminine behavior, but feminine behavior changes, and what is stereotypically woman or womanness or woman-like is going to alter throughout time, as well as what maleness and male-like is going to continue altering. So I think it's a very interesting example. It's just, I don't know, this is an odd chapter, because it's also, unlike the other chapters, it's divided a lot by, like, ellipses, where in the other chapters she divided by sections. This one doesn't really have sections. It's just these, like, different thoughts throughout, and it's also why we appear to be quite confused.
So, final thoughts kind of on the book, and just to follow on from what Paula was saying, is you're seeing this kind of dangerous rhetoric play out now, this idea of I can see what you are, not only in terms of homosexuality, but also in terms of gender and trans identity. I don't know if anybody's seeing this. It's absolutely bizarre. But the face shape, like, they're trying to see the face shape.
We're going back to eugenics and phrenology.
Yeah, literally. The face shape, the body shape, the voice. Oh my God, somebody was telling me that they were trying to go to a conference that had, like, TERFs there, because they were trying to, like, do something for their research. They're not a TERF, I will say this, but they had to literally, to gain access, they had to record their voice, and then the people would listen to the voice recordings to let them in, which is so insane to me. That's actually insane.
It also doesn't work.
No. And also the policing, like, I don't know if people are seeing this, so, like,
women that are just muscly, or women that just don't appear like the little fragile white blonde lady down the street.
Yeah. Or, like, more butch women, right? Who are dressing a certain way because of the butch and femme dynamics. They're now getting questioned in toilets. So this rhetoric of binarizing is still happening today and is still dangerous, which what makes Sedgwick's book still relevant in that way.
Yeah, because when you say that, I just thought about, like, all what's happening right now in the States of women, particularly women of color, are getting stopped and questioned to see if they were trans, and it's like, no, it's just our cultural display of femininity is very different. It was like a joke, but I found, like, this thing where it's just like, why do, like, every Latina grandma, like, once she passes, like, 80, just, like, becomes butch all of a sudden? And it's just like, that's gonna start affecting our grandparents soon, where just because, like, an abuelita likes to have a really short haircut and, like, wear comfortable clothes, as she should, because the 60s were wild, they're going to be questioned their sexuality and identity. It's absolutely dangerous. And it's a really interesting note for Sedgwick to end on, because the last section ends with women. And I'm a bit shocked that that's how the section ended, because women were mostly not really spoken about throughout the entirety of the book.
Oh, they were spoken about in terms of literature, but I've been thinking about it. And so she ends on this line where she says, willy-nilly, however, I have of course been enacting that occupation as well all along. The wrestling into motion that way of this propulsive textual world cannot perhaps in the present text be my subject as it has been my project. So she reinserts herself, but at the beginning, like, of the book, she talks about her relationship as a woman and a straight cisgendered woman.
Is she straight? We don't know.
We don't know, but I have been reading some more stuff, and people say that she's, like, the straight mother of queer theory.
Okay.
So I don't know for definite, but that's what people called her. So she's thinking about her relationship as a woman to her gay male subjects. And so I wonder if that's why she re-enters women.
Yeah, it's a bit confusing. I think it's interesting that it's right in the last bit where she reinserts herself. I think Maybe it's because we don't know the literary references once more. Maybe this would be more poignant if we knew more about Proust. It's not that I don't mind her reinserting herself. I think it's actually quite good that she reinserted herself, sort of as a reminder to the reader, like, hey, this is who's telling these tales. I think it's quite significant. But it came out a bit out of nowhere, because it's like quite literally the last 2 paragraphs, if that.
But I will say, so my kind of final thoughts on this book is that this is a key text in queer theory. It still is today. It might be complicated. It might be very literary based.
Might be messy.
Yeah, it's messy.
Billy Bud.
But I would say if you want to get into Sedgwick's work, and particularly this book, I would say intro and first chapter. I really think that's, personally, unless you're doing the literary stuff, I think that's all you need from this book to like be able to start articulating some of these ideas. And the text is really interesting, but I wonder if it suffers a bit from queer theory's abstraction, but also queer theory was really born out of this focus on literary texts and like English literature and stuff like this, and American literature. And so whilst there's more work now to make queer work more interdisciplinary, and people say this book is interdisciplinary, but I feel like those chapters I was talking about are interdisciplinary. But I think the literary heaviness like really shows it's the discipline she was writing from, right? And it's also bogged down in this really complex language. And it's also, there's some like tangents that provide background information for the main points, but it's not clear when you're reading it where the tangents are going and how they fit until you like get past them.
I concur with everything you just said. This is not a beginner-friendly book. This is not a book I would even recommend for undergraduates. I remember trying to read it in my bachelor's. Like, I'm looking back, I'm like, did I even finish this book? Because I didn't have the context, I didn't have the foundations to fully go through this. And to be quite honest, I don't think I still do. I am very well versed in queer theory, but this is a very complicated text. And it's based in a style of queer theory that I don't practice. I don't do literature queer theory, to be quite honest. And it's sort of why I feel quite combative at times with the text. However, this is a text I will be looking back on and I will be rereading. And I think I'm going to continue rereading for the rest of time, because there is little nuggets within larger arguments that are going to be echoing back over and over and over again, especially within the intro and first chapter. And I will say this last chapter, I think it's one I need to sit with a lot longer. I need to know more about where it's coming from and then put together the pieces. So this is something it requires further analysis. And it made me think about the concept of closet itself. And it's something that, you know, we're currently recording in late September. And, you know, we just had like bisexuality recognition week, but there's also going to be National Coming Out Day soon. And should we celebrate that kind of thing? Or better put, should we be monitoring closets? Should we just let the closet be? If someone wants to have a closet and stay in there and just live the best life they can within it, should we just leave it alone? It once more, it goes back to like the transparent closet, or enforcing or encouraging to come out. Like, people have their own processes. People have their own visions of themselves, whether it be permanent bachelordom or, you know, transparent closet that they're taking a baseball bat to. Maybe we need to do away with the closet altogether. For me, that's not that big of a deal, but for others, they rely on identity, and the closet remains a big part of identity. So I don't know. This is all to say, I have no clue.
So what we kind of want to end on, which we haven't ended on in a while, is the fan fiction. So we individually looked up two fan fictions. Well, Paula's got one, I've got one. And so if I start with mine, I was thinking of Oscar Wilde because Oscar Wilde has brought up quite a lot in these chapters. And so I was looking up the kind of fan fictions, and this one's quite cute. So it's a Good Omens fan fiction. I know it's cute. And so it's called Cavorting with Oscar Wilde by John C. Gray. So that's JONSIGRAY. This is basically a little story where Crowley spots a version of Oscar Wilde's book on Aziraphale's desk and begins to ask kind of questions about whether Aziraphale ever met Oscar Wilde. And he goes, "How well did you know him?" And he goes, "Quite well." And Crowley says, "Quite well as in you went to his plays, or quite well as in you were wearing the green carnation on your lapel."
Ooh.
And it's very cute. It ends with them kind of professing their love to each other. Yeah, it's cute.
Yeah, that's so cute. I love Good Omens. It's back on. I can't wait. I'm waiting for it to all be like done so that I can enjoy it. Mine is wild. So I have been complaining and moaning about the Billy Budd chapter. So I was curious to see if there was even a fandom for this. And AO3 never fails me. There is a fandom. There is only 3 individual works for the Billy Budd people. And let me tell you, they're all in Russian. So obviously I used the good old Google Translate, and my Russian is non-existent. I will never say anything in Russian. I don't know how to pronounce it. So I translated it badly. So it's called Fatherly Consultation by Lana 311990. And I'll read the summary. So the summary is a fantasy on the topic of how exactly Mr. Glagart fatherly consoled newcomer, taking into account some of the characteristics of their personalities. I translated the first couple paragraphs and it was beautifully written, and it basically sounds like it's a POV. You're dealing with Mr. Claggart and you're just on his boat and he's just like trying to get you into the boat situation. It is rated T for teen. So it's not going to be it's not going to be nasty, but I can say that the tags are POV first person, male slash, and then hurt comfort.
By the way, I didn't say the tags because most of them were boring, but one of the tags is idiots in love.
Oh,
that was cute.
All right, I think with that we can say goodbye.
Yeah, we'll say goodbye. Bye.
I want food.
Thank you so much for listening to Theoryish. We really appreciate it and would love to hear your thoughts. Check out our Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter at Theoryish_pod for up-to-date information, and please rate, follow, and leave a review wherever you're listening to the podcast.
If you're interested in finding anything we have mentioned in the episode, please check our show notes or description to find more details. You can also contact us at theoryishpodcast@gmail.com.
See you next time.
Goodbye.